Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today, Tips and Tricks for a Successful ASC 842 Leasing Launch. It is my pleasure today to have some of the Bramisol COE for leasing on, and we're joined by a whole ton of folks on here on the line, so I thank you all for joining. And I look forward to this webinar. I think it's very timely, and I think you will definitely get a lot out of it. As always, some housekeeping items. Number one, the webinar is being recorded, so for those of you who want to share or come back and review the webinar, listen to it, you can do that by joining us. Come over to the website. You can ask questions throughout the period. Right here, you can come down and answer questions. We'll try and answer those. Again, a reminder, some questions, if they're very technical, we'll ask to kind of defer those to later on, and we'll follow up directly, but general questions we'll be happy to answer. You can download previous webinars. You can come here to our website, or you can scroll down further on the page. We have a resource center, and you can visit us here. In addition to the webinars, we have over a couple of dozen, 2-3 dozen resources that you can use, including videos, ebooks, etc. So we encourage you to take a look at that and come on down and do that. Contact us. Obviously, you can contact us. Come to bramisol.com. Join us on Facebook, or join us by joining our LinkedIn group and get some great information about leasing and finance compliance. So with that, we'll go through the agenda. We welcomed everybody. Today, we're going to focus on tips and tricks. We'll talk about 4 basic areas: change management, talk about technical landscape, data really is the focus on some of that. And we'll talk about some of the landscape, resources, and then business involvement, and we'll wrap up with some Q&A. I want to thank, and I'll introduce our panelists. Myself, John Froelich. I am the VP of Strategy and Marketing for Bramisol, and I know a large number of you on the phone, and thank you for coming back. In addition, we have Carlo Maglinao. Carlo has tons of experience. He's working on a large number of projects currently, and has a lot of experience in the real estate CLM and the Nikisa SLAN and Nikisa NLA products as well. He's one of our leading folks. In addition to that, we have Shirish Kandekar, who is also part of our Center of Expertise and brings equally a ton of experience in finance, leasing, and leasing projects. So you guys here on the phone are going to get a great insight. And between these two guys, they probably touch 90+% of the 90+% of the almost 2 dozen projects that we're currently working on, both with Nikisa as well as SAP CLM. So let's introduce this subject by talking a little bit about why are SAP leasing projects so different. Number one, let's talk a little bit about FASB and IASB. If you look at what's going on, you have this transition from ASC 842 to ASC 840 to ASC 842. And while a lot of the pieces in there are similar, you have a big change here where you're now having to take what you see as off-balance sheet leases and off-balance sheet financing and bring that onto the balance sheet. So you have a lot of issues going on with regard to guidance, audit controls, industry adoption, but in addition, unlike the revenue accounting, you have some divergence, if you will, in the standards between IFRS and ASC, between FASB and IASB, so be aware of that. The second piece is this whole concept of the external auditors. So we're going from off-balance sheet financing to on-balance sheet financing. And then finally, the impact to your business. So really, what is the impact to finance? They can spend more time around strategizing around asset management, procurement issues now that you have to track all of these. What does it mean to the audit committee and compliance? And then finally to IT, and what does it mean to automate and enable? In addition, there are some common challenges that we see, and when we talk today, we're going to address some of these in our discussion. Number one is, don't break the legacy. What we see when we run projects, both in any compliance space, is inserting SLAN or CLM or Nikisa into the new processes. How do you do that without breaking what you have in place? And there are a lot of great tools that both SAP and Nikisa have in place to do that. Landscape management, how do you integrate them? Resource skill sets, we'll talk a bit about that. These are not traditional SAP real estate or finance practices. While understanding and insights into how to use them are helpful, this is a lot about movables, movable assets, and so your standard RE/FI practices are going to change. Data quality, we'll talk a lot about that. Collection, normalization, harmonization, always a big issue in any project. Reporting and analytics, if we think about Stephen Covey and beginning with the end in mind, when you think about reporting and analytics, it's all about, at the end of the day, getting to where you need to be. And then finally, security models, really using tools like SAP CLM or SAP's SLAN or Nikisa that are enabled through the security that exists, and managing that security as SOX compliance becomes bigger and bigger. So those are a few of the reasons why SAP projects, leasing projects, compliance projects are very different. Let's jump over and talk a little bit about the insights that we have from our group. So Carlo and Sharish, we're going to get started. Let's talk for a moment about change management. I think this is a big area that we see, across all areas. And maybe you guys can talk for a minute. And Carlo, why don't we start with you, since you're first in the alphabet. Talk a little bit about your insights on training as it relates to change management, and why proper training, whether it's train the trainer or train the end user, is so crucial for the success of a project.
Yeah, John. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you great.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, so far, we've mostly practiced the approach on doing train the trainers. And my experience is that the earlier the customer gets access to a system or a prototype system, whether it's a sandbox or a dev system or a copy of dev, the easier this activity becomes. Which means that really a prerequisite to do this is a working system. Okay, so but that's essential because with the new solution, we're dealing with a new software or a new solution or an additional business function. It's always good to have the business users be onboarded as early as possible to see the impact they see on not just in their process, but as well as how they would, which is a big task, how they would prepare their master data, their lease data. This setting up a working system, by the way, it sounds simple, but in reality tends to be very difficult for most clients. Firstly, because each client has different landscape, and talking about the infrastructure of the application, the database, or the SAP version for the components that's required would be different for each client. Mm-hmm. And so handling that is a challenge. Secondly, is that we're dealing with a new software or a solution or a function. And a good thing to note there is that at this point, the product, whether it's we're talking about SLAN or CLM, at this point, they're not 100% complete. They're right there, but we know that there's some challenges when it comes to the product. So with that awareness, it's a challenge to get that system going and for the users to have access,
Right.
so they know what they're dealing with, which will
Sure.
handle the process and issues that would be encountered. So that's my initial thoughts on that training part.
Sharish, from your perspective, where have you seen this, working well, and what do you think organizations, and projects you've seen were had good success?
So, some of our projects, we've always insisted. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in most of the projects, we've always insisted that, we have good participation from the customer on whether it's from their finance team, whether it's from their IT team. We will always ask for representation from each of these teams that are critical for the success of the project. And so having them along helps them, and we've seen that it helps them appreciate what is required to set up the system. What are some of the issues that we may have along the way? What are some of the data requirements, so that they have an early start and they can sort of work internally within their own organizations to get this information to us. And on the flip side, since they're there from the very beginning, it helps us, since we normally go with the trainer approach, it also helps them, pick up those key nuances within the product and enable them to train internally their own teams. So that's where we've been very successful.
Okay.
Where especially since they have been involved with us along the way, every step of the way almost, it has made their job easier when they're trying to impart the training to their end users.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Let's talk for a minute. A lot of people, we talk about UAT, but I think UAT is a great opportunity in the change management space. Sharish, can you talk a little bit about your experience in UAT and how that has helped with the change management experience and the importance of investing in user acceptance testing and not doing it as a simple check the box?
Well, UAT for most of our clients has been a bit of a challenge, because for many of them, they have never seen these systems. They're probably seeing them for the first time. They are not quite aware of how the expected results will turn out. So it's very important that we identify almost as close as you can get right after at the earlier part of the realization, define what we are going to be testing and how we are going to be producing the results and how do we validate those results. And
Right.
So when we do that, so every step of the way, it was not just, so our UAT for most of our clients was a combination of the work that we did on the IT side, helping them define sort of the scenarios that we would need to test, because that would test all the boundaries of the system. At the same time, help them understand how exactly, what sort of expected results to get from the system, and also have some way to validate that these are accurate. And so helping that enable them to carve out a portion, because there's only so many scenarios that you can test. However, you may have a whole swath of company codes, you may have a whole lot of other parameters that you might want to vary when you're doing your testing. So the UAT becomes a lot more comprehensive exercise. And having us sort of take an early stab at it, for one, ensures that there are really no obvious issues with the product, or at least that we can fix. And it also helps them, take some of the testing that we have done within UAT and use it for their internal training as well. So a lot of these UAT scripts that we had designed, in fact, we had actual screenshots of the steps we took along the way. And they basically were able to use these screenshots as one of the tools for their own internal training. So that was a very good value addition in terms of not just doing a checklist of, okay, this is all the stuff I need to test, but hey, this is how you test it. This is what you should expect. These are the screens that you monitor through. And so this way, next time when somebody's trying to test them, they know exactly the steps to take and the path to follow in the system to get the required result.
Got it. That's great. Talk a little bit about, maybe Carlo, you can talk a little bit about post-launch. We spend a lot of time talking about what goes on during the process, but thinking about and managing the post-launch care process. Can you talk a little bit about planning for that, thinking about it, and what our experience has been on the projects that we've done? We may have lost Carlo. Shirish, can you talk for a second about that? Talk a little bit about post-launch care, et cetera, while Carlo gets back on.
Right. So a lot of companies that we have implemented these solutions on, hold on, I'm getting pinged from Carlo. Okay, he's trying to reconnect, but in the meantime, let me continue before he joins. So what happens is when we have implemented our solutions, these are predominantly sometimes before the actual compliance light date, which is 1/1/2019. So we have done what is called as a technical go live, which means that there is still some work that these companies are going to need to do before the actual compliance date, and that's where they require help. And this could basically be in the form of not only ensuring that they're able to successfully go live. They do implement sort of a business go live, if you may, where they're actually turning on the leases and all of the postings and everything are happening within their internal ERP systems. But at the same time, also ensuring that at key points within their own organizations, such as month-end close or quarter-end close, when they need to generate some of these disclosures, that they have the support from the solution providers that are actually helping them along the way to ensure that they are able to do not only the postings, but also help generate some of these reports that they need to provide. And that's basically part of the post-launch care, which is a very critical piece of the implementation, which sort of happens mostly after the project has ended. But nevertheless, it's a critical step to ensure that at the time of the business go live, or maybe even after that, they have the right support to be able to successfully deliver the reporting and the generation of the balance sheet entries within their own internal ERP systems.
Sure. Looks like Carlo's managing to get back. All right, yeah, and I know that in a lot of projects that you guys have worked on and I followed, planning for that post-launch care is crucial. Carlo, any thoughts about post-launch care?
Hey, John, can you hear me? Sorry, I got disconnected right there.
That's all right. That's all right.
Wow, yeah. Launch care, yeah, sure. Well, it's if you've at that point in the project, you've probably gone through, based on my experience, about 4 cycles of testing. So
Carlo's having a lot of. We've lost you there, Carlo. All right, we'll get back to Carlo. Moving on to the next subject. Shirish, let's talk about data. We know that data, in the case particularly of movables leasing, is big. and that there are huge issues. Talk for a minute about the importance of the abstraction and cleansing process to ensure that the data that you have is clean.
So the one thing though is, the companies have a lot of data. When we talk data, I'm talking about lease data, which is in various shape and form. Sometimes could be a PDF file, sometimes it's a paper that somebody's got, sometimes it could be an email, sometimes something on a SharePoint. So, they have this various pieces of data that has been sitting along for years and years in some system. Sometimes it's not even a system. In many cases, if they're talking real estate, normally they will have something like a Harbor Flex or some such system. But for the most part, when you're talking about movables like equipment and stuff, there would very rarely be any system that most customers use. And that's where the challenges come in, because sometimes identifying the data itself and identifying which of these are leases is a challenge in itself. So again, this is data extraction, abstraction, and cleansing is an activity that almost needs to happen a few months before you even formally kick off the leasing project.
You're in training. Yeah, that should be that should be key.
So, Carlo, we can hear you.
Hey, I'm sorry, Carlo, are you trying to say something? All right.
Yeah,
let me continue then. So again,
go ahead, Go ahead,
just moving along. So as I mentioned, this exercise needs to be started almost before you start the leasing project. And I think that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of data. And depending on the number of volume of leases that you have, you could be talking literally thousands of leases. So it's not a small exercise to collect all this data, get it into some shape or form, which helps you identify all of the various pieces. And then the second challenge is going to be getting all of this data into the tool of choice, be it SLAM, be it CLM. And so normally you could have data that will have a lot of redundancy, that could have a lot of, I wouldn't call it junk, but a lot of data that is not required. And so that's another crucial activity that has to happen, is basically getting rid of all of the unwanted information within your leases. And that's the process we call cleansing, and making sure that you have a good, clean data, because ultimately most of these tools are designed to basically accept data the way you provide it. So you don't want to be stuck in a situation where it's garbage in, garbage out. So you want to make sure that you have good, clean data that has been abstracted from your various sources and has gone through a round of cleansing before it gets loaded into your respective systems that are going to be implementing your leasing on.
And there are companies out there. I know that Nikisa has some tools that they've helped, as long as SAP. But we have a partnership with Back Office, and I think they have some great tools for that. And you want to choose somebody as you go through the process who has experience and expertise, because leases are, a little bit different than your normal abstraction process. So, great point. Talk a little bit about the whole process. So here we have a space where you probably haven't managed this data before, particularly from the perspective of workflows, SOX compliance, et cetera. What are you seeing in terms of what are customers doing? How are they managing that process, Shirish?
So let me take a stab at it, and then maybe Carlo can add something to it. A lot of customers have processes they've already been using in the past. In some cases, we've seen where they already have some approval processes. In some cases, they have multiple levels of approvals within their leasing. And so when they come into these new tools, and these new tools have their own mandated requirements and their own workflows, so sometimes that can be a challenge, because we always get the questions, well, if we already have all the approvals in place, why do we need to further go through these approvals? But that unfortunately is a process that you have to go through, because the good thing is it has built-in SOX compliance for most of these tools. Secondly, it also ensures that only the people that are required to perform those necessary actions are the ones that are performing them, so that you have the right level of control, you have the right level of scrutiny, and you have the right level of approvals that are being provided at various stages along the way.
Right. Carlo, any thoughts on that? Where are you seeing people struggle?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear it? So it's really the preparation of the data is that is a big, you know, well, designing the system, and we've discussed about identifying your scenarios, but the source, which are, you know, the leases, and how you would migrate this to your identified system, okay, whether in Akiza or in CLM, is a big task. It's a big task because if you're looking at the process for both the systems, you have a template where you have multiple worksheets, and a worksheet has to map to your primary worksheet, and it's probably the first time for these users to see this kind of procedure in migrating information from your system to SAP or an Akiza, or from from your starting point, which is really just a hard copy, or an Excel file with a single row for all your information mapped, and an extended columns where you have information that you will have to translate it the way these systems require you to enter the data, so that you could properly load that to the system. That's just one step, understanding how that process works. The other one is that putting in the correct information in the columns that you have to identify, and there is an effort to do a mapping for that. So you will have your working file, and you'll have your mapping file to identify the values for each of the columns, and which are the default, and which are required, which are optional, and which are conditional. So this requires a frequent cadence on whoever is responsible. So it's always good to have somebody full time doing this, and coordinating across the different regions or business units if it's a global company, or which is in most cases that we've handled so far, is essential. So you have that single point person that manages it, because it's a big exercise. It becomes sometimes tedious to not just to prepare it, but also to kind of like explain it to the different business units, and each business unit could be correspond to an asset class, the vehicle, the third-party software that you're dealing with, and then you're the equipment, or again a different one for your real estate property. So the key is that it is to understand the process first of all. Getting into the system, you have to get into the system, whoever is handling it. Map the fields in the system. You have to visualize it and look at the mapping file or your upload file and see where it goes in there, and then identify the correct values that you have to put in there. That should be one of the key points that we've encountered. The other one is that it's not just putting in the value in there, but the correct value. So if it's a jail account, if it's a cost center, it's probably just not just 500, but if you're interfacing with SAP, you probably have leading zeros in there that you have to put in. If you don't know that, you'll have a rough time. You're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's wrong with your file. A value that's 1, it probably needs a single leading 001, so it's probably 01 instead of 1. So these kind of things that you need to test and know the actual value. So there are key things there. One, if you're using S-Line, you just go to one is that you go to the back end and see there's a reference table that the system allows you to view the exact values that you need to put in there. So if to validate that, you have to have access to that to those tables, so you could view what the actual values are, and not just the values that you put in your file. That's one. If it's in SAP and CLM, it's probably it's also again looking at the tables using SE16 or something like that, transaction code. So those are key points.
Great.
Process, which is a major process, which is a really just the big process that we have for this standard is the migration, and even for our testing, we use that file for the testing. If you identified a while ago, Sri was talking about the different scenarios that we have. So we have a couple hundred scenarios, and then we let the business decide which ones apply to them, and that would be our reference point to put in data in that file so that we load them and then we test them. So that ties up to that list of requirements and scenarios to your file. So those scenarios has to be translated to your file so that that when you load them, it actually handles those. So those are things that you will have to look into or consider or must look into when processing your data.
Great. Sharish, you wanted to comment?
So I do want to comment a little bit on the migration aspect of it, because these are sort of sequential steps, if you may. I mean, the first thing you have to do is you have to abstract the data, you have to cleanse the data. Secondly, I think we earlier talked about, it's very critical that we have people that understand the data, because these are the people that we work very closely with when we are working on the data migration, because that's an exercise that you almost have to do to sort of explain, because they don't understand the system, the systems that we implement as well as they understand their own data. So we need to have a sort of way to marry the information that we're going to have uploaded within our system to the information that they have within their own individual systems, however diverse or wherever they may be. So we need to have a mechanism to map from these upload templates that we call them, or data migration templates, and against their source data for their leasing. And so that's a very critical activity, and it has to be done correctly, because that will determine ultimately whether or not you're accurately able to produce the right kind of results for your lease data. And so that is an activity that takes a significant amount of time. So that's also something that is recommended to start as early as possible, because the earlier you get it started, the better off you are. Plus, you need to have a few within your planning. You have to have a few mock runs planned, because depending on the volume of data that you might have, you want to make sure that when it comes time to implementing it in production, that you have a clean run. And so you need to have a few mock runs done in a non-production like environment, where you're loading most of the data and identifying any issues that you might see with that data, whether it be within the configuration or whether it be with the source data itself. And so that's where this activity is very, very critical. It almost happens as a parallel thread throughout the course of the project, along with the rest of the activities that you're doing.
Right. And do you guys recommend, I know in the projects I've been involved in, whether it's, again, RevRec, leasing, or ECC, or ECC to S4, do you recommend starting with small representative data sets so that you can kind of use a filtering approach? You find the large rocks first, you unearth those, you take care of it so that you don't end up having, let's say you're moving in 500-600 leases, and all of a sudden you have, 300 who fail out for the same reason, but you've spent a lot of time. Does it make sense to kind of start with small bites and grow? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that's almost recommended approach. So what we always recommend is start with we call it a pilot data load, which is a small subset of the lease data that you want to upload. And we want to first make sure that this pilot load goes through successfully. And the pilot load could be small, could be as few as 50 to 100 leases, or even less than that, depending on however what your volume is. If your volume is literally thousands of leases, you might want to try to do maybe 100 in the first batch, maybe 500 in the second batch, and then sort of build on that so that it becomes more of an iterative process. And along the way, what that helps us to do is helps us identify some of the major issues that you might encounter, the big rocks, if you may. And then this way, it ensures that all the subsequent data loads that you're doing are successful. So you want to try and identify a sample population of leases that is representative of all of the various kinds of assets or all kinds of leases that you might have, whether it's equipment, real estate, sort of a good sample of the population of each one of these, and then do an upload to make sure these go through smoothly. And then once that's done, then you can move on to bigger and bigger volumes of data to be uploaded.
Right, and it also, if you start small and grow, it'll give you a good idea for planning, if you will, for the actual cutover. You'll know, how long it's going to take you to move all that data over, right?
Right, exactly. It also helps you gauge the time so that you can plan your cutover activities accordingly, and also plan the amount of time it'll take for you to do the data loads in production.
Great. All right. Carlo, you there? Any thoughts?
Yeah.
Before we move on to our next
one. Yeah, I agree with Sharice. And the key, if it's an initial subset, I would suggest a subset of the scenarios that the business has identified. The reason for that is that because it's always good to use your upload file for testing, because what that also means is that the way you prepared your file is how you would expect that particular lease to generate the valuation cash flow. Because it's not just entering information in that file so it successfully loads. Mm-hmm. You would also want to see that what you've loaded would end up with the correct valuation cash flow.
Right.
So the end point is to have the correct valuation cash flow that you expect, that the present value is correct, that the lease schedule is correct, that the depreciation schedule is correct, interest schedule is correct. So in order for that to generate the correct item, we have to make sure that the source information, which is coming from that file, is correct. So if you're testing it, at the start, when you do this exercise, then you'll get better during your testing, which needs to be adjusted, which portion right here needs to be added or, removed, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's move on. You guys touched a little bit on this, resources. I found this an interesting statistic. Over 60% of organizations find that they don't have enough resources to manage these projects. And we talked about it early in what makes leasing projects so complicated. We always, we often run into it. And over 50% say their organization resources are not necessarily aligned to the overall business goals. Can you guys talk a little bit about, and I go through these together, some of the challenges you've seen with resources, either not having enough, not having them trained, or the one that we always run into is, well, I have a day job and a night job. That doesn't always work out. So, Carla, why don't you comment on that, and then we'll have Sharish.
Yeah, it's it has to be clear at the blueprint phase that as you go through the requirements, and you'll have workshops with these identified users, and they'll see, once you do this, once you've a workshop with your asset accounting, your FIAP, your FIGL, your tax accounting, once you've or your lease administration group. Once you've done workshops with them, they'll identify the scope of work that they'll need to do, and then the importance that they need to participate in the project for the project to be successful, because they always tie up. They always start with your lease administration guys putting in the numbers in there, the contract terms and conditions, your lease schedule, and then your asset accounting people identifying how evaluation goes for this particular lease, and making sure that the lease has the correct valuation cash flow, and then your AP guys who identify that it matches with the invoices, whether you're using directly from your system or you're using an existing process. There's always a connection and a requirement, a huge requirement for them to either do doing the as is and do a clearing process and design how to clear that automatically or manually. Is something is something that these guys will have to participate in. And then you have your whether it requires tax reporting, so the folks from taxation will have to be involved. So once they see the or participate in the workshop, they see that they need to participate or be in the project, have to spend some time in the project if they want the project to be successful, because each of these areas have their own responsibility or identified tasks that they will have to, or identified KPIs that they will need to oversee, so that their specific areas are covered. So that's one thing. And then if the other thing that I would think is that this is relative to the process, but there's also, like, I always see a person handling or coordinating all these groups, a specifically full-time person that would handle not just the coordination, but as well as how to manage the information coming from all these areas, specifically for migration purposes.
Great.
So I see that as a critical communication to the business that they need to have full participation or have to participate in order for the project to be successful.
Sure. Sharish, any thoughts on that?
So one of the things I think people don't plan enough resources because for one thing, they underestimate the level of effort it takes to pull off a project like this. So it's a two-way street. I mean, on the one hand, you have the team that's implementing the project. There's the other side of the team, which is also providing all of the inputs for the team that's implementing it. And so obviously that requires some level of commitment, that requires adequate resources that understand the data, they understand the processes, the business processes behind most of these leasing. And so obviously it goes without saying that having a good set of dedicated people that have been trained, or at least are able to pick up along the way all of the information that's required for the leasing project. Because keep in mind, even though a team might be implementing it, there might be decisions or points that they may have to go back to the source team, which is the business team. And it's very critical that they get these inputs on a timely manner and that these inputs are correct. So it's basically goes without saying that we need to have enough number of dedicated resources that have been trained and understand leasing. I mean, they may not understand the tool, but they need to understand the leasing and their own internal business processes so that they can give the good information and accurate information to the teams that are actually implementing it for a successful leasing implementation.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. All right. And you talked about the business involvement, so it's kind of you know, stacking on top of what you guys were just talking about, really. You know, having the finance, accounting, and reporting. Let's talk for a moment. You know, we didn't touch on. You know, at the end of the day, this is all about disclosures and reporting, and you have to comply. Yes, it's a brand new process that you have to introduce. You will need to make sure that it's compliant, whether it's with SAB 74 or internal controls for financial reporting. All of that has to happen, but you need to involve your auditors. Can you guys talk a little bit about how, you know, the companies you've seen that have been more successful involve their auditors in the process?
So typically, a lot of decisions that the companies are making with regards to their leases, you know, it could be as simple as, okay, which leases do I need to see in the balance sheet? Which leases should I keep off the balance sheet? These are some of the decisions that they need to go back to their auditors. So obviously, involving their auditors is very critical. And so all of these teams basically are involved and should be involved in the project. You know, everyone from finance, accounting, reporting. I know when I say finance, you know, a lot of the people are also the key providers for information to the teams that are implementing it. And again, auditors are also the ones that are actually validating figures, validating to make sure that whatever the system generates, you know, meets their requirements of a leasing system or a leasing solution, and basically also provide the input from a reporting standpoint, what's required, what is not adequate, what needs to be customized, things of that nature are inputs that you normally get from your auditors. So we found them to be very useful, even though they may not necessarily be there every step of the way, but at least in the background, you know that they are sort of working with these various teams from finance, accounting, reporting, and providing them with the right kind of guidance and input that they can provide. They can internally provide us or the team that's implementing them to make the right kind of changes within the system, so that you can have a successful solution.
Yeah, and I know, and Carlo, you can comment in a second, but I know, you know, Julio, our director of technical accounting on our team, has pointed out several times the interrelationships between some of these regulations, whether it's IFRS 15, 16, or, you know, pretty importantly IFRS 9, where you have assets and the impairments of those assets and all of that. So it's you know, it's important to involve your auditors and your accounting experts to make sure you've covered all those bases, and you have a report and reporting tool that you know, validates the results as well. Carlo, any comments from your perspective on that?
Yeah, I guess in addition, this probably just, you know, some tips right there is that apart from, you know, one of the really major questions is that, okay, you know, do we it all comes back to their auditors to ask, you know, do we make this part of the lease, or is this a non-lease component? Like what Shri said, is that, you know, should this be part of the balance sheet or off balance sheet? There's still that question, and the auditors really are the key people that would make this, that would help the business make this kind of decision, because system-wise you have the facility to do both ways. At the end of the day, it's the business decision with the approval from their auditors that this, you know, we go this way, and it impacts the design, and it impacts the approach, and impacts, you know, everything that you do for, you know, the next for the entire project. The other thing that you would always kind of like ask during the project is that, okay, so we have these leases, you know, how do you validate that this is the correct, you know, the cash flow for valuation, you know, that this is the correct present value, So that's always also a question. And from my experience, because the business doesn't have this kind of tool, so they always use like an Excel file. So an Excel file has certain formula, and the formula gets really confusing or complicated once you have escalated rents. Once you have events happening in your lease schedule. So and then there's always a back and forth, on how to make this kind of validation. And one key point there that I found based on my experience that the way you calculate this present value is you do this per period. Okay, so if you have that Excel file, you do the present value per period, and then you sum it up to get the total present value for the entire asset. That simplifies the calculation of the present value to validate what you have, whether in KISA and in CLM. So I think that's one of the things that I've found as a kind of like a tip to the business and how they would do this kind of validation.
Yeah, I think the validation and the reconciliations are huge, right? So you'll want to make sure ongoing, not only that you do the validation when you first launch, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you're making sure that the reports work, but as you go forward using a tool, for example, like Blackline for reconciliations, so that as you move from one version to a new version, or you go through transition, you can reconcile your accounts and make sure that things tie out. So absolutely. We only have a couple of minutes left. So guys, that has been some great insight. Let's wrap up with a couple of quick comments. Number one that I heard from what you're saying is preparation. I have Susanto Bordaloy who's on the line, and unfortunately with running out of time, I was hoping we'd have time to talk a little bit about radar, but Susanto and his team have developed this radar methodology, or laser rather, methodology, the leasing methodology. And laser really is a methodology that allows you to prepare in advance and have an organized process to walk through the whole leasing process. And we'll be spending some time in future webinars talking about that, but prepare in advance, whether it's your data, your organization, your management. Preparation is crucial, both for the project, but also, as Carlo and Sharish pointed out, preparation for your go live. Spend the time to cleanse your data, spend the time to do mocks, use UAT properly so that you can get the best results and launch properly. I think I heard, and you guys have told me, have an organized plan with realistic deadlines. And again, using the laser methodology allows you to do that. But regardless of how you approach it, always have a plan in mind and understand that every plan is subject to change. As Pete Graham and I always say, I haven't seen a plan that isn't more complex than we thought it was. Practice, practice, practice for go lives. I think, Carlo, you talked about that specifically. Make sure that you have practiced your go lives, do a couple of mocks, build and start with small amounts of data and grow from there. And finally, make sure to have post go live support. Use the tools, use the systems. They are great, whether it's Nikisa's SLAN, Nikisa's NLA solution, or SAP CLM. They are fantastic tools, the best in the industry, in my opinion. And so you want to have a great tool that works, but also have a great organization that's going to support you post go live as you go through your first few reporting cycles. So with that, I want to thank Sharish and Carlo, and Susanto. I know these guys are working 15, 16 hours a day, 6 and 7 days a week now that all of our clients are getting ready to go live. So guys, I thank you both very much. Hopefully everybody got a lot of great data and information out of this. And I will end the webinar with reminding you that Bramisol is the experts in transforming compliance into competitive advantage. We are the leaders in compliance for finance innovation and the Office of the CFO, led by revenue recognition and leasing. And we look forward to working with all of you and invite you to attend our future webinars coming up in December, focused on SAP's revenue recognition solution. We'll be talking about FP07 with the team in Waldorf, and then we'll be doing more about the leasing solutions. So looking forward to that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and make it a good one.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Shirish.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.